Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is wonderful. I don't think I've ever had proportionately so many questions. There are, I think, are well over 100. And that's impressive. The first one is, you are John Lennox. Are you married to Annie? Well, I'll have to think about that. I've been married to Sally for 46 years. Now, given your background, family, follows a religion, is it not safe to assume this is your bias? Absolutely safe to assume that it's my bias. And that's related to the next question, do you ever have doubts? You see, none of us start from zero. We all start from somewhere. We've got a background, we've got a worldview, we've got influences. But the wonderful dignity of the human being is that capacity, however limited it may be, to select and choose what our worldview is. And I'm so aware of my bias that I've spent my life doubting. Well, the trouble is with the word doubt in English, coming from dubitare in Latin, to be in two minds, is that the moment you use it, it conveys the idea of a great black hole sinking feeling where everything is descending into the morass of utter uncertainty and you're never going to get out of it. That's a very extreme form of depressive doubt. But in the sense of questioning, do you ever doubt? I question all the time. Because the very fact that I'm biased, that I have Christian parents, that I had that upbringing, means that I come and expose it to its opposites. And then I make a selection and I decide. And one of the most important things for me to learn at Cambridge was it's possible for people to change their worldview. I saw people come from atheism to Christianity and agnosticism and so on. So, of course, I do, but I've never had that awful sinking feeling that everything's going to disappear. Why does it scare you? I think they mean, does it scare you, the fact that we are such little consequence in the universe? Well, the argument from size is hilarious, really, because people think the size of the universe, tiny human beings, the microscopic world. And on a linear scale, we're very tiny, but of course I'm a mathematician, so if you work to a logarithmic scale, human beings at less than 2 meters tall are about halfway between elementary particles and the size of the universe. But the real question behind this is, a big universe and an ancient universe is needed to get people like us. You see, it's the inverse. Instead of thinking we are insignificant because the universe that contains us is so vast, I think the answer is the inverse of that. The universe has to be so vast. For example, you have to have at least 2 generations of certain stars to get carbon, and so on. The universe has to be vast in order for carbon-based life to be on it. And size is not the measure of importance. Ask any lady which she'd prefer, a lump of coal or a diamond. Okay, let's move on. This is a Q&A, ladies and gentlemen, which means it's totally unsatisfactory from beginning to end. Because all I can do is make instant suggestions, but the research you do afterwards, who asked the question, is the much more important thing. Many of these questions deserve a full lecture. They're seriously interesting questions. And I hope I'm not going to insult your intelligence, but all I can do is give you a rapid reaction and hope you go on from there. Is math something we discovered or created? Yes. Of course it's both. Because I think we've seen enough evidence that mathematics reflects something out there. Otherwise we wouldn't do it. You see, scientists are great believers. There's this myth around that faith is a religious concept and it means believing where there's no evidence. It is no such thing. Scientists are believers. They have a fundamental faith in the rational or mathematical intelligibility of the universe. They believe science can be done. And Einstein once said, I cannot imagine any scientist without that faith. We need to get rid of this idea in our society that Christians and Muslims and our Jewish friends are people of faith and everybody else isn't. Every school in this country is a faith school. You know that, don't you? There's an ideology. Some of them are atheistic faith schools. Some of them are Christian faith schools. Some of them are Muslim faith schools. But we have been so brainwashed to think that Atheism is not a faith. Of course it is. It's a huge belief system. As I pointed out to Richard Dawkins when he once said, you know, atheism just means you don't believe in God. Well, I said, I notice you've written a 400-page book on it, because it's your positive naturalism that's the flip side of your faith that there isn't a God. You believe a whole lot of things about the universe. We're all believers. The question is what we believe true? Does it cohere, and does it cog in with reality? Do you believe in the Big Bang or the story of creation in Genesis? Yes. That's a confusion of terminology, you see. The Big Bang is a label on a mystery. It says there was a beginning. Genesis says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's saying exactly the same thing in two different ways. There's no conflict between the two. It's just a description with one set of terminology and a description with another set of terminology, and both are correct. Remember, Fred Hoyle coined the term Big Bang as a joke. He didn't like the idea. You and your big bag. He believed in a steady state universe. So there's no conflict. I suspect that question was probably asked by a Christian, and I understand it, because sometimes these things are put up as opposites when they needn't be. Why has science claimed scientia when knowledge is so much wider than science? That's a very important question. Our word science, you see, tends to mean natural sciences, whereas Wissenschaft in Germany means the humanities and the natural sciences, from scientia, which means knowledge in all fields. But we've restricted it. We've cut science to mean in English the natural sciences. And the problem is, what lies behind this question is the widespread conviction that science, natural science, is the only way to truth. Peter Atkins, Richard Dawkins, and so on share that view, and we call it scientism. And it's logically false, because the statement science is the only way to truth is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. It's too late at night for logic like that, so we'll pass on. It says too much, and it's very dangerous, because science is not coextensive with rationality. Einstein once said very perceptively, you can speak about the ethical foundations of science, you cannot speak of the scientific foundations of ethics. There are other levels of inquiry. And if science is the only way to truth, the University of Manchester will have to close half its departments tomorrow. Literature and all of that will have to go. It's a very foolish view, but it's very powerful, because science has given technology, and technology has given us the eye, everything, pad, pod, and all the rest of it, you know. So we're in danger of glorifying science. I'm passionate about it. But to think that science is the only way to truth is arrogance, unbelievable arrogance. I love literature, you see. I'm very fortunate. I had a formal education in science at Cambridge. I've had a private mentor all my life who's a classicist. And he's opened my world to love Greek and Roman thought and literature in wider ways. And of course, when it comes to meaning, science can do nothing. It's literature we look to. As Sir Peter Medawar, who was a Nobel Prize winner, said, it's so obvious that science can't answer all questions. It cannot even answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What's the meaning of life? We need to open our minds to something much wider. What a narrow world it would be if science was the only way to truth. Stephen Hawking says, well, I don't know whether he does, but here's the quote, the human race is just a chemical scum. Wow. On a moderate-sized planet orbiting an average star in the suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies. How do you reconcile the two? And by the two, I think the questioner means, I believe as I stand here that you are of infinite value. You're made in the image of God, whether you believe in him or not. Something my parents taught me, and it's something that I have never had reason to deny, because it is the base for our whole value system, incidentally. Made in the image of God. The universe shows God's glory. It wasn't made in his image. You were. And that gives you infinite importance. And people then, and I've referred to this already, so I needn't say much about it, say, oh, but the universe is so vast and so on. But perhaps that's utterly necessary to have us on it. And our significance is not measured by our size. I look up at Andromeda, I know it's there, it doesn't know I'm here. Have you noticed that? The moon, beautiful in the last couple of nights, I know it's there, it doesn't know I'm here. It's a fascinating thing, the moon, and so is the sun, especially looked at through a solar filter. But we are infinitely superior. We don't get our values from measuring things. That's one of the big problems of modern society, but don't get me onto that. Is your boy successful? What does that question mean? It means how much does he make, doesn't it? What a sad comment on our society. All the wealth of art and culture and everything else is relegated to a measurement on a bank balance. That's not going to sustain anybody permanently, is it? And now we have a whole set of questions on how old is the universe, how old is the world, and so on and so forth. I have no problem with the currently accepted scientific dating. I'll make a very provocative statement. I don't think the Bible comments on the age of the universe at all. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And in Hebrew, the tense of those two statements is different from the sequence of days that follows it. So the logical deduction, if you've never read it before, was the beginning occurs before the sequence of days. So no matter what you believe about them, you can't date the age of the earth, so I won't. But if you're not happy with that, I've written a book about that, but that's shameless advertising. The book is called 7 Days That Divide the Earth. Where do ideas of right and wrong come from? That's a huge question in our society. You see, at the scientific level, I've made certain arguments which I could develop, and I do in my book, that one of the big issues for me is how do you get rationality from non-rationality? How do you get word from non-word? And that's the huge problem of the origin of life. That's the really hard problem, because life is digitally based, it's language based. And that's nothing to do with evolution, of course, because whatever you believe about evolution, evolution depends on DNA to be in existence to start with. So you've got to have life to start with. And Richard Dawkins has befuddled the scene for years by claiming in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, that evolution is responsible for the existence and the variation of life. But he's retracted the first thing, because it's so obvious you cannot use a mechanism to explain something on which it itself depends, and that is life. And the origin of life as a digital linguistic phenomenon is still one of the central problems and the fascinating problems of science. I, of course, believe at one level the resolution is in the beginning was the Word. And that is the thing that in the end gives human beings immense significance. And to say they're just a chemical scum, the word just is a significant thing there. That is the telltale mark of extreme reductionism. The Rembrandt is nothing but molecules of painting and canvas. That's that kind of thinking. And it is false in all our experience. Because if it were true, you wouldn't know it. Because if your thoughts are simply reducible to the random motion of atoms, they wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. You see, what I feel is this, to put it very bluntly, is this kind of reductionism doesn't simply shoot itself in the foot. That's painful. It shoots itself in the brain, and that's fatal. Right. Let's see. Why would God create the human race with free will to question his existence? Well, you can't second guess God. But if I'm just to react off the cuff to this question, the biggest gift that I've been given is the capacity to say yes or no and to ask questions. That's a gift. That's a magnificent thing. The person has put it as if it was negative. It's positive. And it's so interesting that even Jesus, when he was on earth, he asked endless questions and he didn't answer them all either. He provoked people to think. And what a wonderful thing it is to have the freedom. You see, we'll come onto this in a bit because it leads to a huge problem, the problem of evil, and I want to leave that till a bit later. But let's just content ourselves with this. Whatever else it is, the thing that makes my marriage meaningful is the fact that 46 years ago, she, for some reason, said yes. and she could have said no. I know why I said yes. But you know what I mean, that friendships depend on that capacity to love, which is the flip side of the capacity to hate. You can't have one without the other. And that's what makes us human beings. And God is big enough to create beings outside himself who have real dignity and choice. That is a spectacular thing. And it's one of the reasons that I am a Christian. But we might come back to that later. But where did good and evil come from? You see, for centuries in the West, the traditional base for morality has been God, the Ten Commandments, if you like, and so on. That's the base for so much in our society, our legislation, our attitudes to people, the source of our hospitals and hospices and universities and legal system and all the rest of it. But now, in recent years, this is all being questioned, and God's gone out the window. And now there is a huge attempt being made to get good and evil. Well, from where? Well, logically, think about it. If you reject God, there are not many remaining sources for concepts of good and evil. They must be down here. So we go to biology, genetics, sociology, and so on. And David Hume years ago said, one of the places I agree with him, bless his heart, said that you cannot get an ought from an is. You can't just study what is and come to a moral conclusion. There's a huge effort to contradict that today. Because having got rid of God, many of our so-called new atheists see that they've got to have a source of morality. If they're going to abolish religion, as they claim they want to do, they've got to give people a source of morality. And they're having huge difficulty for a very simple reason. Think of Charles Darwin, who was a kindly man with a beard, as you've seen. He studied ants, and he said, well, there's a base for altruism. Wonderful. His contemporary Spencer looked at the same nature and said, it's a struggle, the survival of the fittest. Both of those views have been implied in moral theory. Altruism is a wonderful idea, but the survival of the fittest led to the gas chambers. The trouble with studying animals, ladies and gentlemen, is you can base any morality on them you like. You see, what the battle is for the human soul. Are humans special, or are we just a kind of hyped up animal? And that's at the center of the debate. I see two major problems facing me. One, the status of the universe. Is it created or not? And within that, the even more important question, human beings, are they made in the image of God or not? And that's what lies at the heart of this kind of thing. And Dostoevsky, who's always very interesting to read because Russians tend to have novelists rather than philosophers. So if they want to discuss good and evil, they write a novel about it rather than philosophizing about it. But Dostoevsky once wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. And Jean-Paul Sartre traced the origins of secular atheism to that. And Nietzsche, you see, pointed out contra Dawkins. The new atheists I judge, and many others do, are people who want to retain Christian values and at the same time be atheists. Nietzsche would laugh and say it's impossible. You'll eventually see that you cannot retain basic Christian values that permeate society and reject God. In the end, if you kill God, you'll destroy morality. And I think we see it happening in our society. And I've written about it. So this is a huge question. And I would want to argue that although science and many other things can guide you in terms of, for example, what pain is, that in the end you need a transcendent dimension. Otherwise, morality becomes a sheer matter of my opinion against yours, and I'll win if I've got the power. That's not a way to freedom, it's a way to totalitarianism, as the world has proved successively. But that's a huge topic and a very important question. Now, let's see. There are several questions here about the authority of the Bible. And is the Bible a starting point or a conclusion to your thinking? That's a very perceptive question, you know. because it depends on what linear scale you're working on. If you're working on the scale of my own history, the Bible was a starting point because my parents taught it to me. And you see, the interesting thing is the Bible starts by assuming there is a God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Doesn't attempt to prove it. That's not a weakness. Because as C.S. Lewis pointed out all over the place, every system of thought begins somewhere. The Bible doesn't at the beginning advance any evidence for the existence of God, but of course it does all over the place all the way through. So historically I started with the Bible, but then as I was encouraged by my parents, and they really did. When I was 13, my father handed me a book. He said, "Have you read that?" I said, "What is it, Dad?" He said, "It's the Communist Manifesto." "Have you read it?" "No." "Well, you better, because you need to know what these people think." And as I exposed my faith in God to this and started asking these hard questions, I found there were answers to those questions, you see. And so as life went on, it wasn't now simply the Bible and I've got to accept it, close your eyes, take an intellectual leap. Not at all. You judge the Bible like you judge anything else. Does it make sense? Does it cohere? Does it work? Of course you do. This idea that we start with an authoritative declaration that we swallow it all, of course not. Read it if you like, just as a newspaper. But if you haven't read it since you were a youngster, read it as an adult and ask your questions. So for me, it's an interaction of the two things. And what has happened cumulatively is, as I've studied, and I've gone into the history of it, because I think history is enormously important at all kinds of levels. And so, for example, when I discover that some of the leading historians in the world have set about the task of proving the Bible to be false by taking the narratives of Paul's journeys around the Middle East and showing these places didn't exist or this didn't exist and that, and then in the midway of the research they become Christians because the thing is so convincing. That weighs with me, you see. It's standing the test because one of the wonderful things about Christianity, it's not an abstract philosophy. God is not a theory, he's a person, but the claim is he's interacted with history. And therefore there's evidence in history that we can access. There's evidence in past history, and we access it the same way as we access any historical facts. And then, of course, there's evidence in our own personal history. And if you're asking, how do we know the Bible is solid? Read some of the ancient historians writing about it. There's masses of literature out there. The idea that Jesus rose from the dead raises questions. And if you want, you can ask me about that. Oh, that's something I said earlier. Oh, very good. It's nice to be quoted. I would like to ask you about that. How, in any scientific terms at all, do you explain the purported resurrection? Now, many of my colleagues, this is what they balk at. They said, this is all very interesting, talking about evidence of design in the universe, but come off it, you're a Christian. And you're obliged to believe, well, I'm not obliged to believe, I believe it because I see the evidence that it's true, that Jesus rose from the dead, anastasis, a standing of a body up from the dead. Come off it, you can't believe that in 21st century Oxford. Well, why not? Well, because you see, David Hume said that miracles are violations of the law of nature. If you go to the United States, you see notices all over the place, violators will be towed. Have you seen that notice? The idea of violating a law, that's confusion. And it's seriously wrong-headed confusion. And the way I approach this is this, to point out that Hume was wrong. And I had the opportunity before he died of talking to Anthony Flew, who's the world expert on Hume, and who was for years the world's leading atheist. And at high old age, Anthony Flew, professor of philosophy at Reading, became a deist. He believed in a God because of the structure of DNA, actually. And I asked him about Hume, and he said this to me. He said, it's such a pity. He said, I was wrong about Hume, and all my books would have to be rewritten, and I'll never live to do it. That's tremendous honesty, you know. And here's the problem, you see. The idea that miracles violate the laws of nature is misleadingly false. Let me illustrate it by courtesy of C.S. Lewis. I'm staying in a hotel here tonight. So suppose I was there last night, I put £100 in my drawer, my bed. Put £100 in tonight, 100 plus 100 is 200. Wake up in the morning and there's £50 in the drawer. What do I conclude? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of England? Well, what do I conclude? The laws of England have been broken. How do I know? Because the laws of arithmetic haven't been broken. You see, if I thought, well, 100 plus 100 yesterday was 200, today it's 50, well, that's just how it is. But oh no. You see, I thought the drawer was a closed system of cause and effect. I was wrong. Because a thief came in, or my wife wanted some money for shopping, but we'll leave that aside. A thief came, put his hand in, and removed the money. The laws of arithmetic don't rise up and say, you can't do that. That is an absurd way to think. It's again the idea that the laws of arithmetic are causes. They're not. They're just descriptions of what normally happens. And the fact that we know that they hold tells us that somebody put their hand into the system. That's exactly the same with the resurrection of Jesus. You see, if the Bible was claiming that Jesus rose by natural mechanisms going on in his grave 5 minutes before it happened, then it would be breaking laws of nature. But it doesn't say that. It says that God raised him from the dead by an input of supernatural power from outside the system. So that concentrates our minds on the central question: is this universe a closed system of cause and effect or not? And I think these evidences of the resurrection and other things prove that it is not. I've been told that I have no minutes left. So, have I 1 minute left? 1 minute, one question. What's the purpose of the universe? But you know, this is so like the ancient Greeks, you see. They were so interested in what things are made of, and then they started to ask deeper question: what's it made for? Aristotle had theories of that, of virtue and so on. The excellence of a knife is to cut. What's it made for? And sometimes, I did it the other night in New York somewhere, we were talking about this, and I said, you know, if I sold you a four-wheel drive vehicle, I'm a dealer, an automobile dealer, so I sell you this, and after 3 months, because I'm a very careful chap, I come by your house, and as I'm about to knock your front door, I see this vehicle standing in the middle of a garden surrounded by a flower bed. And as I look closer, I see there are tomatoes growing inside it. Growing inside and so on. And you come out and say, oh, I'm so glad you've come. You know, this is the most fantastic thing you sold me. Do you know, I've discovered on the front of it, there's a thing marked AC. And when I set that at 3, I can grow the best tomatoes you've ever seen. Now, we're laughing, ladies and gentlemen, because that's not what an SUV is for. So let me leave you a question. What are you for? What's a human being for? We know lots about what we're made of. But what are we for? Is there any purpose? That's a hugely important question. Imagine spending your whole life growing tomatoes in a BMW SUV when you could be enjoying it. But what about me? Is there a purpose? And if so, have I discovered it? That's a hugely serious question. That's a good way to stop, isn't it? Right. Okay, thank you. It's always interesting at things like this, even though they're about science and God and so on, that you get a tremendous raft of questions about the problem of suffering and evil. Where is God when tragedy strikes? And there's a whole raft. If there is a God, do you not think he's in many ways evil? If the universe is a universe of order, why does God seem so capricious and detached from mankind? Why do natural disasters happen? Is God powerless to stop them, or does he not care? Why does God allow so much suffering and evil in the world? And so on. And my experience in recent days is that This is the number one question that comes up. Now, it's not our topic. And yet, I feel you probably, since you've voted in such large numbers to have something said about it, I will deviate from my normal practice of trying to keep to the topic, because speakers are often accused of not keeping to the topic. But in a sense, we can make it part of the topic, because one of those questions says, look, we see evidence of order and beauty and so on, and yet the universe is in such a mess. Is God all-powerful and all-good? Well, he can't be both, said David Hume, certainly. Whence then this evil? The old question of Epicurus is as yet unanswered. And many of my colleagues will listen very kindly and patiently to my development of arguments of the kind that you began to hear tonight. I'm afraid it really was only a beginning. And they say, you know, okay, I feel a certain attraction there that there's evidence and I'm a scientist and I can go along with you. But look, I'm sorry, don't please talk to me about a personal God who's interested in the universe. There's so much mess. I can understand that, ladies and gentlemen. I've been to Auschwitz many times and I've wept every time. And as we see the tragedies raging around the world in unthinkable proportions, it's the hard question. I'll never forget arriving in Christchurch 2 days after the earthquake struck and having to change every talk I gave because the only talk they wanted to hear was earthquake. Why? And I had to meet people who'd been bereaved the week before. So how do you face it? I'm going to try to face it honestly. But I want to say there are two problems and there are two perspectives. There's the problem of pain, natural evil, tumors, cancers, earthquakes, tsunamis, things that nature appears to do that are not at least directly engineered by other human beings. And then there's the problem of moral evil, the bad things that people do to one another. They're different, but they can be connected. Deforestation through greed can create the next generation with a problem of pain and starvation. And then there are two perspectives. It's one thing to be a professor of oncology. It's another thing to be told you've got 3 months to live because you've got pancreatic cancer. And in a room this size, I suspect there's not a family that's not touched by tragedies. And I want to be very sympathetic here because I can assure you, I understand why people reject God because of this. It's the hardest question we face, by far. I want to suggest, though, that it's the hardest question my atheist friends face as well as the hardest question that I face. Many of my friends say, look, I'm sorry, but there's no God. There can't be a God. And often I just say to them, okay, there isn't a God. But now I have one or two questions for you. If they're not particularly suffering but are interested in it philosophically, I say, well, you talk about the problem of evil, but if there isn't a God, where do you get your concept of evil from? Because if you're following Richard Dawkins, he'll tell you straight that this universe is exactly as you'd expect to find it. If at bottom there is no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's the end of all morality, all good, all evil. And the problem is, why then does he in particular talk about the problem of evil? I think I know the answer to that. Because although his atheistic logic leads him to deny the existence of moral values, he's a human being made in the image of God, and therefore he's a moral being. And his nature rebels against it. And it raises the question. So there's a philosophical question there. Where do you get your concept of evil from? Second point, if you take God out of the equation, then of course, in one sense, you solve the problem. That's just how life is. You haven't got rid of the suffering or the pain, by the way. Obviously not. It's still there. One thing you have got rid of is all hope, of course, by definition. And this is an enormously important thing. You see, try to follow the logic of it with me just for a moment. if there is no God, this life is all there is. So by definition, death is the end, so there's no hope. And now you've got a colossal problem, and it's this. It's the problem of justice, ladies and gentlemen. If atheism is true, the vast multi-millions of people who have ever lived will never see justice, never get it in this world, and there's no world to come in which they could get it. So that their consciences that cry for justice, they're an illusion. And there are many people that will tell you that straight. Our genes, our selfish genes, giving us an illusion of morality to help us to cooperate, as Michael Ruse and E.O. Wilson put it more or less. Is that the solution? And I once said to Richard Dawkins, I said, it's bleak, Richard. And he said, yes, it's bleak, but that doesn't mean it's false. And I said, no, but it doesn't mean it's true either. So you see, the atheist route leads literally to hopelessness. And we've got to face that. Now, to be fair to Richard and Peter Singer and others with whom I've debated these things, and by the way, you can see lots of this online if you want to follow it. I always forget to give people my website where you can see debates, interviews, all kinds of things. johnlennox.org, johnlennox.org. That there's a cut-off, this bleak, hopeless, nihilistic vision of the world. Well, it may be true, but is it true? Is our conscience that cries for justice an illusion? Now, how do I face it? Now, here, ladies and gentlemen, is where my Christianity becomes important. Anybody perceptive listening to me tonight will see that many of the arguments I have advanced can be and are accepted by the three great monotheistic religions in the world. The belief in a creator, after all, is biblical. And it comes from prior to Abraham, so it's part of all the Abrahamic religions. I'm going to try and give you the short answer, but I hope not a simplistic answer to this question. We've all argued, and there are several questions that I haven't read that go like this. Surely a good God could have, would have, might have, did have. Have you argued like that when you were a student or even as an adult? Have you ever got anywhere with that argument? Is there anybody in the room who's ever had that argument and come to a satisfactory conclusion? I've never met one, including me. And you know, when you run around an argument for centuries and you get nowhere, it might be good to ask a different question. Now, the problem, the reason we don't get anywhere, in my view, is very simple. It's because as we look at the world, we see a mixed picture. Beauty and barbed wire. Two cathedrals, if you like. Coventry Cathedral, Christchurch Cathedral. Go into Coventry Cathedral, you see that bombs have hit it. You also see traces of a former beauty, don't you? Beauty and bombs, beauty and barbed wire. Christchurch, an earthquake, but traces of beauty. Beauty and barbed wire. So the question I ask myself is this. We all see it's like that. So the question I want to ask is this. Is there any evidence anywhere that there's a God that you could trust with that? Now, that's a huge question. And that brings me to the heart of the Christian faith, which is a cross. Have you thought about it? Try and come with me. You may not share my view, but at least listen to what Christianity says. The central claim is that Jesus was God incarnate, the Word encoded in humanity. Now, if that's true, this is God on a cross, to put it crudely. But what's God doing on a cross? Well, at the very least, you'd be very blind if you didn't observe that it tells you something very important, that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. Can you trust a God like that? The flip side of that is the resurrection. If it had ended on the cross, nobody had ever heard of it. But if Jesus rose from the dead, that means something magnificent. The early apostles burst into the world and they said, you know, Jesus rose from the dead, therefore there is to be a judgment. There will be an absolutely fair assessment. That's magnificent news. Because that's the moral base of our whole moral system and our conscience. They're not telling lies. And so, although I have a problem, I see a way into a solution. I don't call it a solution. That's too simplistic. But having sat by many people in their last hours or just facing huge tragedy, I'll never forget the note I got in Christchurch, the lady that walked out early. She didn't want to see anybody. And she wrote me, said, "You've brought me the first hope that I have seen." You see, that's one of the reasons I'm a Christian, ladies and gentlemen. Because here I see something huge. Because it not only gives me a way into the problem of evil, it gives me a way into the problem of my evil. Because I haven't even kept my own standards, let alone God's. What about me when the judgment comes? And of course, the central claim of Christianity is that Christ died for my sin. You say, do you really believe that? Yes, I do, of course. Because it makes sense, and you can test it. And this is my final point. Some people say to me, you know, you're a scientist, you ought to test things. Well, of course I am. I've tested Christianity. Christ claims to you tonight that if you turn away from the mess you've made of life and trust him, he'll give you peace. He'll give you eternal life. He'll give you forgiveness. You can test that. I've seen it work thousands of times. And when you've seen alcohol turned into a happy family that's got food on the table, when you've seen people rescued from divorce after divorce after divorce, when you've seen children reunited with their parents, when you've seen people brought off drug addiction, and they all tell you that it was Christ that helped them, you begin to see that's evidence that the thing's true. Of course it is. It's testable. But, ladies and gentlemen, you've been very kind to me. You listened to me for ages. And my colleague, Richard Dawkins, he's asked a lot of questions at the beginning. So in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to ask him a question or two. Come up here, Richard. Because the reason I'm here tonight is that we have a very interesting association. And he's a senior businessman in the city of London. And yet a man who finds, as I hope he'll explain to us, time to find the relevance of the Bible with his senior colleagues. How does that work, Richard?
Well, I tell you, this is where I think my friends are at. And I work in a market which is enormous. It's the Lloyd's insurance market. So it's a large market with lots of senior people. The truth today, John, is that our generation achieves at an age that our father's generation never saw. And what that can mean is that you can get to the age of 40, and by now you've actually tried marriage, some of us many times. You've actually had the toys, and you've parked them up and discovered they didn't do quite what you expected. You've had the job with the title, or not, by the way. Life's not gone the way that you expected, and you didn't get these things. But for many of my friends in a senior capacity, they've actually had the job for a long time now, and they are not at peace. The comment that more of my friends make than any other is that they fear retirement, they don't think they found the answer, they do not have a love that passes all understanding, and they do not have a peace that passes all understanding. Now, what that's led to is an interest in exactly what you've talked about tonight. And you've quoted quite a few times, in the beginning was the Word. Now, as you well know, that comes from John's Gospel. So what's actually been happening in the city and beginning to spread out for a huge amount, it's literally gone global in the last 7 years, is some notes which take John's Gospel and actually show that to people who are not saying, I'm interested in Christianity, but are simply saying, I haven't got the answers to life, and I have always promised myself one day I'll read the Bible.
So is that what this is all about? I mean, spell it out concretely. Okay. I mean,
Here's the Bible. Now, the reality is this book has sold more copies than any other in the history of printing. It sits on more of our bookshelves than any other book. And here's what you can do with it, because it's actually utterly useless like this. You can pick it off the bookshelf and you do this. You blow the dust off it. Because like that, it is useless. It's closed. And the reality is, in an age where we are biblically ignorant, We don't actually know where to start. What do I do? John, you've said a lot about the Bible. Do I open it at the beginning and do I start reading Genesis? Well, you can. It's quite a large book. You might find that difficult. If we actually go back to what's happened in history, we talked about the Chinese earlier. When Mao Zedong kicked out the missionaries in the 50s, all the missionary societies thought this was a disaster. China will be an absolute wasteland. What the missionaries left behind was this. And when we got access to China again, we discovered that this had been copied and copied and copied, and people were taking sections and they were beginning to understand it. So in the city, we decided to do exactly the same. We took John's Gospel and we put it in little booklets. And the way the booklets work is on one side are a few verses systematically starting at the start of John, in the beginning was the Word, and some really helpful notes that explain what those verses say. Now, you'll be delighted to hear these were not written by an insurance executive. They were written by one of the best Bible teachers of our generation. His name's William Taylor. He runs a large series of churches in London. So it's good stuff. It's not me. These booklets have gone ballistic. I now have had to change my career so that I see 20 CEO, chairmen, and executives on a one-to-one basis to show them this. The problem with
you sit down with them with this.
Yeah. Well, look, what we do is we sell them in. These are the first 4 chapters of John. We sell 2 book 1s, 2 book 2s, 2 book 3s. You do not need a leader's guide. You don't need to do any background study to be able to do this. You've got one, I've got one. We open it, we start going through it together. That, John, has gone ballistic.
And people are prepared to do that. Aren't they frightened of doing it? Or
here's the statistics. In 7 years of doing this, I have offered this to my friends. And all I'm saying, by the way, and all I'm suggesting to anybody who does this tonight, is to get a set of the books and for 1 hour only, just look at the first 18 verses of John 1. It's unique in the Bible. It is an overview. We would call it in this room an executive summary. All I'm suggesting is, whoever invited you here tonight, if they're a Christian, ask them, put them on the spot, get them to get a set of these books, and if they run out tonight, Peter Horlock is running a list to be able to get more, and simply have a 1 hour coffee that looks together at the first 18 verses. Now here's the statistics. In 7 years, I've done this with more men than I can now count. Only 6 people have stopped at the end of that first hour and not gone on to read the rest of the book. 6. I see 20 alone at the moment. Okay?
How often do you see them?
I see them roughly once every 10 days, and I see them for 45 minutes to an hour.
So you're seeing 20
Yes.
senior executives every 10 days for an hour?
And these men are not saying I'm now interested in Christianity. They're simply saying, you're right, Richard. I've always said to myself, one day I ought to read this book, and I am saying I don't think I've got the answers to life. So if this is supposed to be the Word of God, if it's the instruction manual for how we're supposed to live, it's probably worth having a look. Now, do you want the really stunning statistic?
Yes, I do.
Every single... That's a relief. I'd have been in trouble if he'd have said no, wouldn't it? This is a really serious point. Every single person I have done this with in the last 7 years has said the following: why has no one ever shown me this before? See, the reality is we don't go to church. The reality is we don't have the Bible at home. The reality is we don't have the Bible at school. So we think we know what it says, but we don't actually know what it says. And when we get into it, we discover it does have the answers to life. It does bring a peace that passes all understanding. It does actually say, instead of being fearful of my retirement, I know where I'm going. Life now has an end which leads to eternal life. I'm just passing through here. I'm off for eternity. And I'm going to be right with God, not through anything I've done, and as you've very eloquently said tonight, but because actually God came down and saved me through the cross of Christ. Well, how do I know that? Because I need to read what he has said. So there's a danger, ladies and gentlemen, with an evening like this. It can be a thoroughly interesting, intellectually stimulating evening. Then what? So our challenge to you tonight is to actually don't allow this just to be a thoroughly interesting, intellectually stimulating evening, and then do nothing about it. Our suggestion tonight is exactly the suggestion which has sold 32,000 of these sets in just over a year. It's grab a friend, get a set, they're dirt cheap, and actually have a look. What does the Bible say? It's not a big ask, and all we're suggesting is you do it for 1 hour. If you don't enjoy it, don't go on, but we guess that you will.
Now, Richard, every insurance document I've ever had is small print at the bottom. What's the bottom line?
The bottom line is that I could now take you to London and introduce you to executive after executive after executive who is saying, what I thought I had, I now realize is nothing in terms of the richness and the fulfillment and the sense of direction that I now have gained. And it's not me that's done it. It's not about being, I don't mean me personally, it's not them that have done it. It is not about being good. It is about realizing there is a free gift. It is God's grace, God's riches at Christ's expense. Where do you find it? You have to open this. That's difficult. This is simple.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.